The January morning broke over the Montana Territory with a kind of cold that felt like a living thing, malicious and patient, waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Catherine Morrison stood on the wooden steps of what had been her home for 3 years, watching her breath crystallize in the air before her face, each exhalation a tiny cloud that seemed to freeze and fall like diamond dust. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 25 degrees below zero, and the sun, pale and distant as a memory, offered no warmth, only a weak light that made the snow-covered landscape look like the surface of some dead, frozen planet. Behind her, inside the small cabin, 6-year-old Benjamin was crying. Not the loud, demanding cry of a child throwing a tantrum, but the hopeless, hiccuping sobs of someone too young to understand why the world had suddenly become so cruel. Mrs. Morrison. The banker, Theodore Welch, stood beside his hired man near a wagon loaded with her possessions, or rather what little remained of them. Most of the furniture, all of her husband's tools, even the good quilts her mother had made, had already been sold to cover the debt. What was left, a few clothes, a cooking pot, some basic supplies, and her husband's hunting rifle, sat in a pathetic pile in the wagon bed. "You need to be going now. We have another family moving in this afternoon." Catherine turned to face him, this man in his expensive wool coat and fur hat, this man who had never missed a meal or wondered where his next would come from. "My son is 6 years old. It's 25 below zero. Where exactly do you expect us to go?" Welch's face remained impassive, though something that might have been discomfort flickered in his eyes for just a moment. "That's not the bank's concern, I'm afraid. Your husband signed the papers. He knew the terms. It's unfortunate he died before the debt was settled, but the bank has been more than patient. It's been 4 months. 4 months since Daniel had been crushed between 2 freight wagons at the depot. 4 months of trying to keep up with payments she couldn't possibly make on a seamstress's wages. 4 months of watching the debt grow while the winter deepened and her options narrowed to nothing. "My husband died working to pay your bank," Catherine said, her voice quiet but hard as the ice hanging from the eaves. "He was moving goods for the same company that finances your railroad investments. But I suppose that doesn't matter." "I'm sorry for your loss," Welch said, and the words sounded practiced, hollow. "But business is business. The wagon will take you as far as the town proper. After that." He shrugged, a small gesture that dismissed their lives as easily as clearing snow from a step. Catherine looked past him to the vast expanse of white that stretched in every direction. The nearest town was 8 miles away, she knew because she'd walked it twice a week selling her sewing. 8 miles in 25 below zero with a 6-year-old child. They might make it. They might not. She had $17 sewn into the lining of her coat. She had the clothes on her back and Benjamin's, plus 1 change each. She had a pot, a pan, 3 blankets, the rifle with 8 cartridges, a knife, some salt, a half-pound of flour, and a small leather pouch containing her sewing kit with needles, thread, scissors and thimble. She had her hands and her will. And she had Benjamin, who needed her to be stronger than she felt, braver than she was, smarter than the cold and the world that had turned against them. "Come on," Catherine called toward the cabin. "Benjamin, it's time to go." The crying stopped. There was a long moment of silence, and then the boy appeared in the doorway, his small face red and swollen, his eyes huge and frightened. He was wearing every piece of clothing she'd been able to layer on him, 2 shirts, a sweater, his father's old coat rolled up at the sleeves and tied with string at the waist, 2 pairs of wool socks, and boots that were already getting too small. "Where are we going, Mama?" Catherine climbed back up the steps and knelt in front of her son, pulling his scarf up higher around his face, tucking his mittened hands inside the too large coat. "Somewhere safe," she said, and hoped it wasn't a lie. "Somewhere warm. Can you be brave for me?" Benjamin nodded, though his chin trembled with the effort of not crying again. They climbed into the wagon. The hired man drove without speaking, the only sound the crunch of runners on snow and the occasional snort of the horses. Catherine held Benjamin close, feeling him shiver despite all the layers, feeling her own body start to ache with the cold that was already seeping through her clothes like water through paper. The wagon left them at the edge of town with their meager possessions piled in the snow. The hired man tipped his hat once, a gesture that might have been apologetic or might have been habit, and then he was gone, the wagon disappearing down the white street between buildings that looked like they were carved from ice. Catherine stood there for a moment, looking at the town. She had $17. A room at the boarding house, if one was even available, would cost 75 cents a night. Food would cost another 50 cents a day for both of them. At that rate, her money would last perhaps 3 weeks, maybe 4 if they starved a little. And then what? The town had no work for a widow with a child. The other seamstresses had made that clear enough on her previous visits. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know, sweetheart." She picked up the bundle of blankets and supplies, tested the weight of the rifle, and looked out past the town to the white wilderness beyond. "We're not staying here." "Where are we going?" "I don't know yet." She took his hand. "But we'll know it when we find it." They walked. The first hour wasn't so bad. Catherine kept them moving at a steady pace, following a stream that ran to the north of town, its surface frozen solid, snow piled along its banks. Benjamin asked questions at first. Where were they going? When would they stop? Was this the way? But gradually he fell silent, saving his breath for walking, his small hand gripping hers through their mittens. The second hour was harder. The cold had moved past discomfort into the realm of pain. Catherine's face felt like it was made of wood, stiff and numb. Her feet were beginning to lose feeling, and she knew that was dangerous, knew that frostbite could claim toes and feet as surely as it could claim lives. Benjamin was stumbling now, his legs tired, his body too small to generate enough heat to fight the cold. They tried to shelter in a stand of pines. Catherine managed to get a small fire started with precious matches from her kit, feeding it twigs and dead branches. They huddled close, and for perhaps 20 minutes there was warmth. But the fire ate through the small fuel too quickly, and the wind kept tearing the heat away before it could do much good. They couldn't stay here. The trees offered some protection from the wind, but not enough. Not for a whole night. Not at 25 below zero. They walked on. The third hour brought them to what looked like an abandoned trapper's shelter, 3 walls and half a roof, the interior filled with drifted snow. Catherine dug out enough space for them to sit, wrapped Benjamin in 2 of the blankets and herself in the third, and they sat pressed together, shivering, as the afternoon light began to fail. "Mama, are we going to die?" The question was quiet, matter-of-fact, delivered in the way children sometimes speak terrible truths without fully understanding them. "No," Catherine said firmly. "No, we're not. I promise you that." But sitting there in the ruined shelter as the temperature continued to drop and the shadows lengthened, she didn't know if she was telling the truth or just another comforting lie. They couldn't stay here. But she didn't know if Benjamin could walk much further. And she didn't know where they would go even if he could. She made herself stand. Made herself pull Benjamin to his feet. Made herself pick up their supplies and start walking again, following the stream because it was the only direction that seemed to mean anything. The sun was nearly gone when she saw the cliff. It rose perhaps 100 feet above the stream, a wall of gray rock and blue-white ice, massive and ancient and utterly indifferent to their existence. The stream, she realized now, flowed from somewhere inside or beneath the cliff. She could see where it emerged from a dark space at the base of the ice, a crack perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. She stopped, staring at that darkness, at that opening in the ice. "Mama, what is it?" "I don't know," she said slowly. "But we're going to find out." The opening was indeed a crack, a narrow space where the glacier met the underlying rock, creating a gap that the stream flowed through. Catherine knelt at the entrance, peering into the darkness. She could hear water running somewhere inside, could feel, and this was what made her breath catch, warmth. Not much warmth. But after hours in 25 below zero, even a few degrees felt like paradise. "Stay here," she told Benjamin, then crawled into the opening. It was tight for the first 10 feet, the ice pressing close on one side and the rock on the other. But then the space opened up, and Catherine found herself able to stand. She pulled one of their precious matches from her pocket and struck it against the rock. The light flared, and Catherine gasped. She was standing in a cavern perhaps 30 feet wide and 20 feet high. The ceiling was a sheet of blue glacial ice, smooth and glowing faintly in the match light. The walls were rock on one side and ice on the other. And in the center of the cavern, steam rose from a pool of water perhaps 8 feet across. A hot spring. 40 or 50 feet beneath a glacier, heated by some volcanic source deep in the earth, there was a pool of hot water sending steam curling up into the frozen air. The match burned down to her fingers and she dropped it, standing in the sudden darkness with her heart pounding. This was impossible. This was miraculous. This was salvation. "Benjamin," she called back toward the entrance. "Benjamin, come here. Carefully now, crawl through the opening just like I did." She heard him coming, heard his small grunts of effort, and then he was there beside her in the darkness. She struck another match and watched his face as he saw what she had seen: the cavern, the pool, the impossible warmth. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes huge in the flickering light. "Is it magic?" "No, sweetheart," she said, and felt tears starting to freeze on her cheeks even as she smiled. "It's science. And luck. And it's ours. This is home." That first night, they didn't build much of anything. They were too cold, too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the simple fact of being warm. Catherine pulled their supplies through the narrow entrance, arranged the blankets near the pool, close enough to feel the heat but not so close that the constant moisture would soak through, and then they simply sat, letting the warmth seep into their bones, letting the shivering gradually subside. She fed Benjamin small pieces of the precious flour mixed with water from a hot spring, testing it first to make sure it was safe to drink, and then they slept, huddled together under the blankets while steam rose from the pool and condensed on the ice ceiling overhead, creating a constant soft patter like rain. When Catherine woke, she had no idea what time it was. The cavern was dark except for a faint glow from the entrance where daylight filtered in. Benjamin was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even, his face relaxed for the first time since the eviction. She stood carefully, her muscles stiff and aching, and made her way to the entrance. Outside, the world was still frozen, still deadly. But inside the cavern, the temperature held steady at perhaps 50 degrees, cold enough to need blankets and layers, but warm enough to survive. More than survive. They had water from the spring, clean and hot. They had shelter from the wind and cold. They had space and warmth and safety. What they didn't have was food. Catherine crawled back into the cavern and began to take stock. She had the half-pound of flour. She had the salt. She had the rifle with 8 cartridges. She had the knife and the pot and the pan. And she had the stream. The water that flowed from the hot spring ran across the cavern floor and out through the entrance. If there was a hot spring, then somewhere beneath the ice there must be places where the water stayed warm, or at least unfrozen. Places where fish might gather. Places where life persisted even in the heart of winter. She woke Benjamin gently. "I need you to be very brave," she told him. "I need to go outside and see if I can find us some food. Can you stay here and be safe while I do that?" He nodded, his eyes wide but trusting. Catherine took the rifle and crawled out into the brutal cold. The contrast was shocking after the relative warmth of the cavern. The air hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then her lungs adjusted and she forced herself to move, to think, to plan. The stream flowed out from the glacier and continued north through the snow. She followed it, looking for any sign of life, any indication that something edible lived in these waters. A quarter-mile from the cavern, she found what she was looking for. The stream widened here, creating a pool perhaps 20 feet across. And in the center of that pool, where the water from the hot spring had kept the ice from forming completely, there was a hole. And in that hole, she could see dark shapes moving. Fish. She had no fishing line, no hook, no net. But she had the rifle and she had desperation, and she had killed game before years ago, when her father had taught her to shoot. She knelt at the edge of the ice, aimed carefully at one of the dark shapes, and fired. The shot cracked across the frozen landscape, echoing off the cliff behind her. The fish scattered. But one floated to the surface, a trout perhaps 14 inches long, dead or stunned by the concussion of the bullet passing through the water near it. Catherine didn't hesitate. She lay flat on the ice, reached into the freezing water, and grabbed the fish before it could sink or recover. She ran back to the cavern with it clutched in her frozen hands, her breath coming in gasps, her fingers already going numb. She crawled through the entrance and back into the warmth, and there was Benjamin, standing by the pool, his face lighting up at the sight of her and her catch. "You got one," he said. "Mama, you got one." "I did," she said, and started to laugh, a sound that was half triumph and half hysteria. "I did. And we're going to eat well tonight, you and I." She cleaned the fish with her knife, working carefully in the poor light from the entrance. She had no fire yet, had been saving their matches, not sure how many they would need, but she needed fire now, needed it for cooking and for light and for the simple human comfort of flames. She remembered her father teaching her to start a fire with a bow drill, remembered watching him work with wood and cordage and patience. She had never done it herself, but she had seen it done. And she had tools and materials and time. It took her 2 hours. 2 hours of finding the right wood, dry dead branches from pines near the entrance. 2 hours of carving and shaping, of creating a bough from a curved branch and the string from unraveled thread from her sewing kit. 2 hours of friction and frustration and failure, her hands blistering, her arms aching, while Benjamin watched with wide eyes and sometimes asked quietly if she wanted him to try. But then, finally, she saw the first wisp of smoke rising from the fireboard. Then the small pile of tinder began to glow. Then flame, actual flame, small and precious and perfect. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she carefully fed the fire, building it up with small twigs and then larger branches. She looked at Benjamin and saw him crying too, not from sadness now but from sheer relief and joy. "We have fire," she said, her voice cracking. "We have warmth and water and food and fire. We have everything we need." She cooked the trout over the flames, using a flat stone as a cooking surface. They ate it with their fingers, savoring every bite, and it was the best meal Catherine had ever tasted. That night, they slept by the fire with full bellies, warm and safe in their impossible refuge beneath the ice. Over the next weeks, Catherine transformed the Glacier cave from a survival shelter into something approaching a home. She started with the entrance. The 3-foot gap in the ice was enough to crawl through but left the cavern exposed to drafts and outside air. Using stones from along the stream bed, carried one by one in multiple trips that left her exhausted, she built a wall that narrowed the opening to just 18 inches at floor level, large enough to move through but small enough to block most of the wind. She mixed mud and clay from the stream bed with small stones to create a kind of mortar, and though it wasn't perfect, it helped seal the gaps. The door itself took longer to figure out. She couldn't use wood, there wasn't enough available nearby, and what there was, she needed for fire. Instead, she created a layered curtain using the leather from her extra boots, sacrificed with regret but necessity, pieces of canvas from their supply bag, and strips of hide from the animals she managed to trap. The trapping had been Benjamin's idea, actually. He'd been watching her prepare the third fish she'd managed to shoot and had asked, very seriously, "Mama, what if we run out of bullets?" And he'd been right. She had 7 cartridges left. 7 chances. After that, they would have to trap or snare or starve. So Catherine spent 3 days creating snares from braided thread and wire carefully extracted from the lining of her coat. She set them along the stream where she'd seen rabbit tracks in the snow, and she used small pieces of the precious flower as bait. The first snare caught nothing. The second caught nothing. The third caught a rabbit. Catherine had never killed a rabbit with her bare hands before. She'd never skinned one or gutted one or prepared one for cooking. But she learned, working slowly and carefully while Benjamin watched, and when they ate rabbit stew that night, cooked in the pot with water from the spring and seasoned with the last of their salt, she felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with the meal and everything to do with what it represented. They could do this. They could survive. They could thrive. The cave itself required organization. Catherine designated different areas for different purposes: the sleeping area near the pool where the warmth was greatest, a cooking area near the entrance where smoke could escape, a storage area where they could keep food and supplies cool but not frozen. She created a drying rack using branches wedged into cracks in the rock wall, and on this she hung strips of rabbit and fish to preserve. She made pouches from rabbit skin to store the dried meat, keeping them in the coolest part of the cave where they wouldn't spoil. Water was never a problem. The hot spring provided an endless supply, and Catherine created a simple cooling system by placing water in the pan near the entrance, allowing it to cool to a drinkable temperature while remaining cleaner than the stream outside. Light was harder. Matches were too precious to waste, and keeping the fire going constantly used too much wood. Catherine experimented with creating simple oil lamps using fish oil and twisted fabric wicks, and while they didn't provide much light, they lasted longer than firelight and could be easily relit from the main fire. Benjamin helped with everything. At first, Catherine had tried to protect him, to keep him from the harder work. But she'd realized quickly that this was a mistake. He needed to feel useful, needed to be part of their survival, needed to learn skills that might save his life if something happened to her. So she taught him to tend the fire, to check the snares, to recognize which plants near the stream were safe to eat and which were not. She taught him to clean fish and skin rabbits, to braid cordage and shape wood. She watched him become more confident, more capable, more independent with each passing day. "Mama," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, "are we going to live here forever?" Catherine looked around the cavern, at the blue ice ceiling, at the stone walls, at the pool with its constant curl of steam, at the fish drying on the rack, at the rabbit skins stretched for tanning, at all the evidence of their unlikely survival. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But right now, this is home. And it's a good home, isn't it?" Benjamin nodded. "I like it here. It's warm. And we have each other." "Yes," Catherine said, pulling him close. "We have each other. And that's what matters most." January became February. February became March. The world outside remained frozen, but inside the glacier cave, life continued. Catherine's snares provided a steady supply of rabbits. The fishing hole, which she checked every 3 days, carefully rationing her remaining bullets, still held fish. They had food, warmth, shelter, and safety. Until the ice began to crack. It started with a sound, a deep groaning that seemed to come from the glacier itself, a sound like the earth shifting or God's awakening. Catherine was checking their food stores when she heard it, and she froze, listening, trying to understand what it meant. The second crack was louder, sharper, and this time she saw the cause, a fracture line appearing in the ice ceiling, running from the far wall toward the pool. "Benjamin," she called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Benjamin, come away from the pool. Come here right now." He came quickly, sensing her fear. "What's wrong?" "The ice," she said, staring up at the ceiling. "I think it's shifting." Over the next 3 days, the cracks multiplied. The glacier was moving, settling, shifting, responding to the same pressures and stresses it had always experienced, but now those forces were directly above them. The ceiling that had seemed so solid, so permanent, was revealed as what it truly was: ice, frozen water, temporary and unstable and potentially deadly. Catherine lay awake those nights, listening to the groaning and cracking, trying to calculate their options. If the ceiling collapsed, they would be crushed or buried. If they left the cave, they would freeze in the still brutal temperatures outside. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. The answer came to her on the 4th morning as she was starting the fire and Benjamin was bringing water from the pool. "Mama, look," he said. "There's steam coming from the crack." And there was a thin curl of vapor rising from the newest fracture line, which ran almost directly over the hot spring pool. Catherine stared at it, her mind working. Steam meant heat. Heat meant the crack went all the way through the ice. And if the crack went through, then above them wasn't solid glacier, it was open air. She grabbed the longest branch they had, a piece of dead pine perhaps 8 feet long, and carefully, standing on a stone near the pool, reached up to probe the crack. The branch went through. Up and up, until finally, at perhaps 6 feet, she felt resistance and then breakthrough. Cold air flowed down through the opening, mixing with the warm air from the pool, creating a column of moving air. "Benjamin," she said slowly, "I think we just got a chimney." The crack, she realized, was both a danger and an opportunity. Yes, pieces of ice might fall, but if she could widen it carefully, shape it, then they would have ventilation for their fire and smoke would have somewhere to go besides filling the cavern. And the hot spring would keep the opening from freezing shut. She worked carefully, using a long stick heated in the fire to gradually melt and widen the crack. It took 5 days of patient, exhausting work, but by the end, they had a natural chimney running from just above the pool up through 6 feet of glacier to the surface. The steam from the spring kept it open, and when they built the fire directly beneath it, smoke rose straight up and out. "You know what this means," Catherine said to Benjamin as they sat by the newly efficient fire, the air in the cavern clearer than it had been in weeks. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're improving. We're making this place better." Benjamin nodded seriously. "When spring comes, will we leave?" "When spring comes," Catherine said, "we'll decide. But I don't think we have to anymore. I think we could stay if we wanted to. This is a real home now." The crisis had been real, the danger genuine. But they had survived it, had turned it into an advantage. And in doing so, Catherine had realized something important: they weren't victims anymore. They weren't just refugees from the bank's cruelty and the winter's harshness. They were pioneers, innovators, survivors in the truest sense. They had found warmth in the frozen world. They had made a home inside a glacier. And they had done it together. The first sign of spring was sound: the dripping of meltwater, the crack and groan of shifting ice, the sudden chatter of birds that had been silent for months. Catherine heard it all from inside the cavern, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she crawled out through the entrance in daylight just to see what the world looked like. It was March, and the temperature had climbed to perhaps 20 degrees, still cold, but manageable compared to the depths of winter. The snow was beginning to retreat from the exposed rocks, and along the stream, she could see the first hints of green pushing up through the mud. She stood there for a long time, looking at the cliff face, at the small column of steam rising from the chimney crack they'd created, at the careful stone wall she'd built around the entrance. From the outside, you wouldn't know anyone lived here. The entrance was so small, so easily overlooked, that they were completely hidden. Which raised an interesting question: did she want to stay hidden? That evening, she and Benjamin talked about it by the fire. "We could stay," she said. "We could live here through the summer, maybe even build something outside if we wanted. We could trap and fish and gather, and when winter comes again, we'd already know how to survive it." "What about town?" Benjamin asked. "What about other people? What about them?" Catherine said gently. "They didn't help us when we needed help. The bank threw us out to die. What do we owe them?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't you miss people though? Don't you want to talk to someone besides me?" And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? She did miss people. She missed conversation and commerce and community. She missed the feeling of being part of something larger than just her and Benjamin and their impossible survival. "I think," she said slowly, "that maybe we don't have to choose. We could stay here, this could be our home, our base. But we could also visit town, trade what we have for what we need. We wouldn't have to hide." "Would they be nice to us?" Benjamin asked. "Or would they be like Mr. Welch?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "But I think we're strong enough now that it doesn't matter as much. We don't need them to survive. We've proven that. So if they're kind, that's good. And if they're not..." She shrugged. "We have our own place. Our own life." 2 weeks later, Catherine walked into town with Benjamin beside her and a pack full of tanned rabbit skins and dried fish. People stared, the widow Morrison who'd been evicted in January and presumably died in the cold. But here she was, alive and healthy, with a child who looked better fed than half the town's children. Word spread quickly. By the time she reached the general store, a small crowd had gathered. "Mrs. Morrison," said the store owner, a decent man named Patterson who'd always treated her fairly. "We thought, that is, everyone assumed, that we'd frozen to death." Catherine said calmly. "We didn't. We found shelter. And we've been quite comfortable, actually." "Shelter where?" someone in the crowd asked. Catherine smiled. "That's our business. But we're doing well. Better than well. And we have these to trade, if you're interested." She showed the rabbit skins and the fish. All caught and prepared since January. Patterson examined the goods with a practiced eye. "These are good quality," he said, surprised. "Very good quality. I'll give you fair price." They traded skins and fish for flour and salt and coffee and other supplies they couldn't make or find themselves. And as Catherine shopped, she listened to the whispers, heard the speculation about where they'd been, how they'd survived, what kind of woman could keep herself and her child alive in the worst winter anyone could remember. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them speculate. We know what we did. We know who we are. As they left town, Benjamin looked up at her. "Are we going home now?" "Yes," Catherine said. "We're going home." They walked north along the stream, following the path Catherine now knew by heart. When they reached the cliff face, she paused, looking up at the stone wall she'd built, at the narrow entrance that had saved their lives. "You know," she said to Benjamin, "I think next summer we might build something out here. A real cabin. We could use this place in winter and the cabin in summer. We could have the best of both, the warmth of the spring and the space of the outside world." "Would we still be hidden?" Benjamin asked. "We'd be private," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference. We don't need to hide anymore. But we don't need to share everything either. This is ours. This place, this life, this survival. We earned it." She crawled through the entrance, and Benjamin followed. The cavern was exactly as they'd left it, warm, dry, safe. The fire was banked but still alive. The food stores were full. The pool steamed gently in the center of the space. Catherine stood there, looking around at their impossible home, and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval and everything to do with what she and her son had accomplished. They'd been evicted in 25 below zero with nothing but a few possessions and each other. They'd been left to die by a world that saw them as inconvenient, as failures, as less than human. And they'd survived. More than survived, they'd thrived. They'd found a glacier cave with a hot spring. They'd learned to trap and fish and preserve food. They'd built walls and doors and chimneys. They'd created a home from ice and stone and determination. "Mama," Benjamin said, "are you crying?" "A little," Catherine admitted, wiping her eyes. "But they're happy tears. Because I'm so proud of us. Of what we did. Of who we became." "Are we pioneers?" Benjamin asked. "Like the people in the stories?" "Yes," Catherine said, pulling him close. "We're pioneers. And this is our story. And it's still being written." Outside, spring continued its slow arrival. The snow melted. The stream swelled. The world turned green again. And inside the glacier cave, a mother and her son sat by their fire, warm and safe and together, having proved that even in the coldest winter, even in the most impossible circumstances, human determination and love could create something beautiful. They had been evicted by a bank. They had been dismissed by a world that saw them as less than valuable. They had been left to freeze in temperatures that should have killed them. Instead, they had found a cave of ice. They had discovered a spring of warmth. They had built a home that would shelter them through many winters to come. And in doing so, they had become something the bank and the town and the cold world could never take away from them. They had become survivors, innovators, and pioneers of the impossible. The fire crackled. The pool steamed. And Catherine Morrison, who had once stood on the steps of her old home with $17 and no hope, now stood in her cave home with everything she needed. She had warmth. She had water. She had food and shelter and safety. And she had Benjamin. And that, she knew, was worth more than any bank account, any proper house, any approval from a world that had never valued them anyway. They were home. And they were free.